I do believe here Bulgaria in many respects was closer to Russia than places like Poland or Hungary or the Czech Republic, because part of the view of the Bulgarians to the market was very much based on the way they see things happening basically in some neighboring countries like Greece. So when it came to market, on one level, on general level, Bulgarian public was very much supportive because they knew very well that the socialist type of economy simply does not work. And people had a huge kind of interest in consumer goods and consumption. But what was the problem was that many people, and this is true till now, they don't see major of the market institutions that have been established as a proper market institution. In a certain way, the idea was there is a market that functions, but it is not our market. Our market is too small, it's too much corrupted, it's too much insiders market. And I do believe this critical view of the market remained. And from this point of view, countries like Bulgaria and Romania are probably closer in their ambivalence than Russia. The difference is that nevertheless that people are much more skeptical than, for example, Poles or Estonians when it comes to what the market can deliver. Bulgarians are also not optimistic and kind of hopeful what the government can deliver. While basically I do believe in the case of Russia, at least based on the opinion polls that I have been studying, you have this very strong expectation that kind of the well-being should come from the state. The state should provide salaries, the state should provide jobs. And I do believe this is especially true for some of the big industrial centers where you have these company towns during the Soviet periods, and where basically for people, everything is the state. Listen, disappointment with the market, or even with democracy, is not a Russian phenomenon. There is now a serious studies being done showing that countries in Central and Eastern Europe, basically post-communist societies, are much more unhappy when it comes to their life satisfaction than you expect if you calculate only their GDP or GDP per capita. It's very important with whom you compare yourself. For example, there was this famous value survey which was done for years by the Michigan University. And in the 1980s, they were trying around the world to measure how happy people are. And it appeared that then Nigerians were as happy as West Germans. There was no correlation, positive correlations between happiness and economic well-being. 20 years later, it was very different. 20 years later, Nigerians were as happy as their GDP is going to suggest. What has changed for these 20 years? What has changed was that simply Nigerians got televisions. And basically they discovered how the Germans are living. So you have this phenomenon of unhappy transition, which is typical even for countries which otherwise, in objective terms, are doing very much. And this is true even because in a certain way, the best and the worst that happens in the transition is the same thing. It's going to be unfair to believe that basically Russians went disappointed while all East Europeans became very happy. This disappointment even can be seen in very successful places like Poland. I do believe that there was one major mistake, but this mistake was very much shared by everybody. It was not a particular mistake of the Russian reformers. I do believe this was the thinking of all this reformist class of the 1990s. They do believe that it's enough to basically remove the old system. And the market and democracy are going to come as the natural state of affairs. Also, they believe that the moment when you're basically removing state regulation, what is emerging is the market. But the truth is that you need a very functional state in order to have a functional market. And I do believe this is something that basically the reformers in many countries underestimated, and this was of course much stronger in Russia because of the size of the country, but also because of the nature of the economy. So as a result of it, when you have the privatization, the logic of people like Chubais was it's enough to put the economy in private hands, and then basically private owners are going to take care of themselves. But it was not the case. And as a result of it, for people, what they saw was not so much the marketization of the economy, but the corruption of the economy. What used to be a state monopolist became a private monopolist. And the private monopolist can be even more painful. Because for the people, they even less possibility to influence decision-making. I do believe that, of course, the nature of the Russian economy, where in Russia, basically, you're not so much exploiting people, but nature, in order to get money, this even more kind of strengthened this negative trend. This allowed really people who didn't basically achieve much to become the huge billionaires and others of incredible type of wealth which they did not have created. And I do believe this made people extremely suspicious. The story was that what happened after 1989 was, in a certain way, privatization of the profits and nationalization of the losses of the economy. I do believe that the first thing that is quite important and which is common in this disintegration is that in the moment of disintegration, political arguments and political sentiments are much more important than the economic logic. When an empire starts to disintegrate, don't listen to the economist, even to the smartest one. Because probably they're not going to get right what is going to happen. Because people have a totally different rationality, and you can have even people from a small and totally economically unsustainable parts of the Soviet Union who believe that it's enough for them to go on their own, to become independent, and they're going to become rich immediately. The second thing, which of course was very important, was the Soviet Union didn't collapse as a result of a war. We can talk as much as we want about the Cold War and the Soviet Union losing the war, but there were neither American nor German soldiers on the territory. And it makes, because of this collapse, so much more difficult for the people to live with. And the third, which I also find quite important when we're talking, is that because of the nature of the Soviet Union, and here Soviet Union is different, for example, than former Yugoslavia. Some of the institutions that existed in the periphery were not present in the center. For example, the Russian government or the Russian Communist Party were not there. So from this point of view, I do believe that one of the interesting stories that is very typical for all these countries and all this empire that disintegrate, it's quite important for the disintegration to try to see where the drive comes from. And it never, in a certain way, periphery never can disintegrate an empire. The Baltic republics wanted to leave, I mean, from the very first day they were in. But it was not the leaving of the Baltic republics that basically determined the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the decision of the Russian Federation that they cannot share the burden, basically, in their views of keeping others. That very much predetermined what happened. And I do believe that here, both President Yeltsin and others didn't manage to explain this to the Russian public. And this is why, till now, the collapse of the Soviet Union looks as a kind of a big conspiracy from outside. If you read, for example, the documents about unification of Germany, if you see basically how the West was imagining how Europe is going to look after the Cold War, all this was based on the assumption that in one or the other form the Soviet Union is going to survive. So from this point of view, the very popular narrative that Soviet Union was disintegrated because of the pressure from outside, in fact, is not right. The outside was afraid of the disintegration of the Soviet Union because of the nuclear weapons, because of everything. But when this happened, in a certain way, this outside, and especially the West, declared this as their own victory. I will try and come probably with 5 things. First is, unfortunately, in Russia, never there was what you have in Eastern Europe, the founding elections. The first elections on which the major division is between communists and anti-communists, and the breaking up with the past is very clear. There was, of course, anti-communist forces in Russia, but unlike in many other countries, because the elections in 1989, 1990, they have been still in the Soviet framework, still the Communist Party was the leading party there. The second question is, of course, the problem of 1993 and the Constitution. You ended up with a very presidential constitution, which didn't allow for political parties to have much more say in the political life. I can imagine why it was done, and there is, of course, a strong tradition. But I do believe that the nature of the constitution and also how the crisis of 1993 was resolved by using force against the parliament very much contributed to this anti-institutional thinking that can be perceived in many in Russia when it comes to democracy. One of the big questions, which I know that it's very easy to be asked now, but could it be that Russian democracy was going to benefit if the communist candidate had been won in 1996? Not because the communist candidate was a better candidate, I was going to vote if I was Russian for President Yeltsin then, but because of this turn of power, because people are going to have the feeling that they're empowered. It's them who decide who is going to govern the country. But because it was done at the moment when you have an acting president and acting power, I do believe it created this legacy of a very strong manipulated elections, this type of a very technological view of what's happening, which hurt Russian democracy. If you go to the fourth important element, of course, this was the 1998 financial crisis. And here I do believe this was a positive view, because you have a major crisis, but this crisis didn't lead to the collapse of the democratic or economic system. And I'm saying this because one of the strengths of the democratic regimes is their capacity to survive crisis. In a certain way, much often, democracies consolidate themselves not by their successes, but by their capacity to survive crisis and failures. In the relations between Russia and the West, there was one very important moment, and this is my fifth critical moment, which is very much underestimated, and this was NATO's decision to bomb Serbia. If you go to opinion polls, you're going to see that the relations of the Russian public to the West dramatically changed as a result of this war. And the difference was that the West and Russia was seeing the Yugoslav crisis in a totally different perspective. For the West, and particularly for Europeans, the Balkans and the Balkan wars represented everything that Europeans hated in their own history. Ethnic nationalism, ethnic cleansing, destroying the others. But for Russia, what they saw in Yugoslavia was foreign intervention in a disintegration of a former state. And they basically identify with Serbia, not because of huge sympathy for Milosevic regime, and even not for kind of a pan-Slavic sentiments, but because basically they saw themselves as kind of an analog to the Serbs in this process of disintegration of Yugoslavia. And I do believe that it was at this very moment when some of the major kind of suspicion and mistrust on public level, not on elite level, between the Russian society and the West started, and it was on the basis of this suspicion and mistrust that after that in the 2000s, when the Russian government and the Russian president decided to use anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism as a political resource, this is why it was so easy for him to do it. I don't believe that anything is inevitable. I do believe that there were different decisions that probably were going to have totally different outcomes, and also I do believe that there is luck. Luck with the political leader, luck with the political situation. So from this point of view, Russia was not very lucky, but if we also want to be honest, it was not very unlucky too, because there could be a much more major kind of inter-ethnic conflict, and there could be much more problems in disintegration of the Soviet Union. But one of the reasons it never happened was that some of these conflicts have been simply frozen. And in the last years, including basically the last conflict in Ukraine, you can see that basically the disintegration of the Soviet Union was not completed. And now we can see part of these conflicts coming back. Because if you go to the history of Europe in the last 25 years, normally we're telling this as the history of one project, and this is the enlargement of the European Union. But if you see closer, you're going to see 4 different projects that have been underway, and by the way, all of them now are in their own crisis. First, of course, was the remaking and the enlargement of the EU, which was very ambitious and big project. But then you have basically the emergence of Russia as a new independent state. And like the new European Union, Russia was born in 1991. This post-communist Russia was very different than pre-communist Russia and very different than communist Russia. Also as an identity, as an ambition, but even as a borders. And then you have a major change in Turkey, where you see the emergence of post-Kemalist Turkey. And Turkey became more democratic, but not necessarily more pro-Western. And then you have almost 20 new states that have been born in Europe. This type of birth rates of states you can see only during the decolonization in Africa. The problem with these states is that many of them has only their names and their borders. And they have, especially in the post-Soviet space, they have only two sources or resources for governing. One was the Soviet legacy, the other was the anti-Russian sentiment. And these two have been playing all the time. You basically have the networks coming back to Soviet time, many of these networks being also criminal in their nature. But on the other side, when Ukrainians or others are asked who you are, the only thing that they can claim is we're not Russians. And I do believe that this is now what we see as the major crisis in Europe these days, is the fact that for different reasons, all these four projects have basically their crisis. Russia didn't manage to basically perform modernization of the economy of society, and this basically ended up with a totally different form of mobilization society that you have now. European Union, and this can be seen with the financial crisis and refugee crisis, also basically fractured. This post-Kemalist Turkey is kind of very controversial in its own, and many of these small states that appeared after the end of communism, both in the Balkans and the post-Soviet space, looks very unsustainable. Moldova, you look around and you can see that it's a very badly governed places with a very weak political identities. So I do believe in a strange way now, 25 years after the beginning of the changes, it allows us to see more than one history of what is happening, and I don't believe that anything was inevitable.